Before we get started, please go over to Amazon.com and grab a copy of my book, Education and Justice. If you have an African-American son in public school, you need this book because I teach you the many ways that public schools mistreat African-American boys and what you can do to help your son. So go over there and get your copy immediately. Hello, everyone, and thank you for watching this video. So this is part 3, the final part of my response to a panel of black men who voted for Trump and continue to support him. In this video, I will continue responding to these brothers and how they demonize the Democratic Party. I will break down the Southern strategy, how the parties realigned themselves after the Southern strategy, and which party has done more for us since then. I will also explain why domination, not demonization, of the Democratic Party through impact voting is the smartest strategy right now in our political journey. If you haven't seen parts 1 and 2, the links are in the description. So let's listen again to what they said, and then I'll break it all down.
What are the key characteristics or traits that best describe today's Democratic Party? Elliot, why don't you go first?
I would say liars, a lot of people doing insider trading, a lot of people are working for lobbyists and not for the people. I'll say they pretty much failed at everything. I think lost. They're a lost group.
Kasim, go ahead.
I'd add to that with, with the lying, just a bunch of false promises. I would say attack on our children with these pushed agendas. Just not really relatable, just trying to sell a dream that's not the reality.
I would say manipulation. To me, it feels like they more want to scare you into following them than to go on with what your, heart really thinks should be done. So I would say manipulation.
Learn to be honest. Be honest for sure. Do something. Because they always say they can't do something. Do something.
Don't show us something in this head and you're hiding 1,000 other things that you're going to do behind our back over here. That part. Just be upfront. Be real with us. That's what they need to do.
Now, let's turn our attention to the Southern strategy. What is it? What happened? Why am I talking about it? Well, I already did a video on the Southern strategy some time ago, last year, 2024, when we had much fewer subscribers. So many of you have not seen that video. I will put the link in the description, or you can just pay attention now. But I will go back and watch that video because I spent a whole video talking about just the Southern strategy. But anyway, the Southern strategy was a Republican political tactic to attract Southern white voters by appealing to their backlash against the Civil Rights Movement. So because of the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 64 and some earlier measures that the Democratic Party was doing, the Republican Party said, hey, this is an opportunity, because there are a whole lot of angry white people who don't like the fact that the Democrats are trying to now help black people. So they began to say and do a whole lot of racist things, a lot of racist stuff to attract those old Dixiecrats in the Democratic Party. Okay? Now, you heard me mention Barry Goldwater earlier. So he opposed the Civil Rights Act in 64. He was a senator, again, from Arizona. He opposed the Civil Rights Act of 64. And that set the groundwork for this Southern strategy. And it was in that very year that Democratic Senator Strom Thurmond, as I said earlier, switched party from the Democratic Dixiecrat Party to the GOP in protest of the Civil Rights Act. And then following the enactment of the Voting Rights Act in 65, many, many, many more of those old Democrat Dixiecrats left the Democratic Party and went into the Republican Party. All right, they just couldn't take it. First, it was the Civil Rights Act of 64, and then the Voting Rights Act of 65. They essentially said, enough is enough. I'm leaving the Democratic Party, and we're going to the Republican Party. And more and more and more and more of them left and went to the Democratic Party. Now, even more of them left in '68 when Richard Nixon ran for president, and he ran on the promise of law and order. Where have we heard that from? Well, we hear it a lot from Trump. Law and order. He also ran on states' rights, which is a favorite of Southern whites dating back to slavery, because they resented Northern troops coming down into the South fighting to end slavery. They argued that the states, Southern states, had the right to do whatever they wanted to do with the Negro, as they called blacks back then. So Richard Nixon used that dog whistle, law and order, states' rights. You don't have to say the word, don't have to say the N word, don't have to use that. They knew they didn't have to use that anymore. They could just say certain buzzwords, as Trump does today. Law and order, states' rights. They know the words to use. Critical race theory, DEI. You see, they're constantly updating their use of certain words, their repertoire of words. They're constantly updating them. Thug, DEI, critical race theory, woke. All those words are dog whistles which point the finger at us, African American people. Law and order and states' rights were two favorites then. And they're still favorites today, actually, right? So he ran and used those words a lot. You remember how so much more racial Trump became in the final few days of the 2024 election? A lot more, because that gets whites riled up, get them fired up, and they respond. And then Ronald Reagan took the strategy further in the 80s, launching his 1980 campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, which was the location of the 1964 murder of 3 civil rights workers. Okay, and he basically argued states' rights as well. I remember this extremely well. I was a college student. All right, and then in 1984, the Southern strategy worked so well. It got so many of those Dixiecrats to leave the Democratic Party and become Republicans that a former senator, Trent Lott of Mississippi, said, and I quote, "The spirit of Jefferson Davis lives in the Republican Party." Who was Jefferson Davis? He was the president, first and only president of the Confederate States during the Civil War. That's what they were fighting for. They were ceding, they were pulling themselves away from the Union. And that's when Lincoln and the Union Army went to war with them. But they wanted to, those Southern Dixiecrats wanted, back during slavery, to break off and form their own country based on white supremacy. And it's their descendants who today occupy the Republican Party. And those are the people that these brothers are supporting and voting for. And again, I just have to ask, do they know this history? It's just weird. Then Nixon's war on drugs began in the 70s, intensified in the 80s. You see, you talk a lot of black men talk a whole lot about the 1994 crime bill. But many do not say anything about, probably, maybe don't even know about Nixon's war on drugs that started long before the 1994 crime bill. A lot of these brothers, they are very critical of the Democratic Party, and they have no smoke for the Republican Party, the party that has shown its hand time and time and time again against African Americans. So the war on drugs, mandatory minimum sentences, that's where this started. That's where this started. No parole for federal drug offenses. Militarization of police. Racial profiling and stop and frisk tactics all began with Nixon not the Democratic Party, with Nixon, the Republican Party, the new Republican Party, not the old one, the one with all the Dixiecrats in it. And let me just say, of course, some of those Dixiecrats remained in the Democratic Party. No question. But most of them went to the GOP. And they're still there today, or their descendants, with that same strong opposition to Black progress. So that was Nixon's war on drugs. And yes, let's talk about Biden's 1994 crime bill, although that's not the name of it. And, there's some things I have to say about this crime bill. I was alive then, in 1994. So I remember what was going on. And it was all about crack cocaine and how it was decimating our community. Hit my family hard. I lost two younger brothers during this period. All right? Who were in one way or another involved in the trafficking business. I lost two younger brothers. I know how horrendous the crack epidemic was for the African American community, and the African American community was begging Congress to do something. Something that was targeted toward crack, because the war on drugs that Nixon started, a lot of people just felt like, many blacks, more needed to be done. And so the Congressional Black Caucus supported the 1994 crime bill, and it resulted in basically jailing and imprisoning a lot of African American men. But I'm going to tell you something else that was going on. Once again, I'm going to remind you, not only were a lot of black men being locked up, a lot of black men were being killed. And again, something had to be done. I remember in the 80s when thousands of black men were being killed a year around the drug trade. I remember when good, outstanding, law-abiding women began prostituting themselves, abandoning their children, because crack was so addictive, so demonic. And this was the response to it, the 1994 crime bill. Was it perfect? No. Did it exacerbate what the war on drugs had already started? Yes. Yes, it did. So black men were 13 times more likely to be in prison for drug offenses than white men, despite similar drug use rates. Well, the crime bill was more aimed toward drug dealers than drug users, but they all got caught up, all of them. And between 1980 and 2000, the number of black men in prison grew fivefold. Communities were destabilized. Funding shifted from rehabilitation and education to punishment and policing. So you lay the 1994 crime bill on top of the war on drugs, and you got the results that we got. Nixon's war on drugs. Here you see this chart. Roots, the root of mass incarceration. Nixon's war on drug was the root of mass incarceration. Biden's 1994 crime bill just continue what had already happened. Racial sentencing disparity, extreme under Nixon's war on drugs. It just continued under the 1994 crime bill. Jump down to the one just before the bottom, intentional targeting. Nixon aide admitted racial motive. One of Nixon's aides admitted that they created the war on drugs to target immigrants and blacks. Black and brown people. as always, as is what's happening right now. Biden's 94 crime bill was not driven by racism. It was driven by panic and exacerbation, frustration, desperation, because we were suffering from that scourge of crack. And something had to be done. So, if you're going to talk about the 1994 crime bill that the Democrats did out of desperation, then you got to talk about the foundation for it all, the war on drugs that was created as a racist targeting effort by the Republican Party. So, I'm winding down. Let's talk about which of these two parties has been most beneficial for African American people. Well, the antebellum period, which is the period before the Civil War. Basically, you could say both of the parties just messed us over. I mean, they continued a slave system for 246 years. So they were both white supremacist parties back then and were just simply exploiting our free labor. So they both failed. All right, what about during the Civil War and after the Civil War? You'd have to give that to the Republican Party for passing the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and for getting blacks elected to Congress so that they could fight for civil rights. What about post-Reconstruction to the Great Depression? Neither. Republican and Democrat parties failed us. To end Reconstruction, it was a Republican president, Rutherford B. Hayes, who cut a deal with the Southern Dixiecrats and basically allowed them to take control of the South again so that Hayes could become president, which basically sold us out. So they both failed during that period. And then what about the period from the Great Depression onward until about the 1948? You would have to kind of give that to the Democratic Party because they were making that shift after FDR came up with those social net programs that did help some blacks, although there was racism that kept a lot of blacks out of those programs. And then these last three periods here, Democratic Party all the way. 1948 to 1965, that was during the Brown v. Board of Education case. Many other cases that Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund fought and won that brought down segregation. And then, of course, 64, 65, we saw the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act. And then after the Civil Rights period, post-Civil Rights era, again, the Democratic Party gets that as well. Affirmative action, anti-discrimination laws, public school funding, Fair Housing Act, and from 2000 to present, straight Democrat have done absolutely more for the African-American community than the GOP. It's indisputable. It's indisputable. Elected the first black president, the first black female president. We got the first black female SCOTUS justice. Those are not symbolic. These are real tangibles from the mid-60s to now. Okay, black judges, federal judges. The Department of Education, Jimmy Carter, it's now being torn down. That's why it's being torn down, because the GOP, those Dixiecrats, those white supremacists, have always hated anything to benefit blacks. They've always hated them, those things. And I told you in the last video, I'm telling you, the Biden-Harris administration was very, very pro-black. And that was because, if you remember when Biden was running for election. He was losing until he got to South Carolina. The South Carolina primary, when a lot of black folks voted for him, that saved his presidency. That saved his candidacy. And he went on to become president. And a lot of black political operatives told him, if you want our vote, here's some things you got to do. And he did those things. He kept his promise. So we got record HBCU funding, record student loan forgiveness, record reduction of black child poverty reduction. We got record small business administration loans for black entrepreneurs. And I could go on and on and on. What about the black farmers who got that record settlement for the discrimination they suffered? One of the most pro-black presidency, I would say second to Lyndon Johnson. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Vice President Harris was prepared to continue that record had she been elected. But so many men, black men like the ones you saw here, voted against her. And now, we're all paying the price. And got 4 more years of this. And I'm telling you, it's going to get worse. It's going to get worse. I just pray we make it out of this. I said in my last video that blacks who voted for Trump made the political blunder of American history. I'll say that until someone who has some data to prove me wrong. My data proves I'm right. And more data is coming because Trump got more on the way. Okay? That's my response to these black men. That's my response. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with my conclusion. And that'll be the end of the video. So I said here, the core political question for African Americans isn't whether a party is Republican or Democrat. It's whether it advances conservative or progressive policies. For the last 65 years, the Democratic Party has advanced more progressive racial justice policies and delivered the most gains for African Americans in areas like civil rights, voting, education, and health care. That is indisputable. And we see now an administration that is dismantling everything it can, including the National Black Museum. All because some black men and women, especially black men, younger black men, and by the way, a lot of those guys in that video were older. But they fell for the okie doke and they supported the party, this new Republican Party that is once again dominated by the Dixiecrats to Southern Dixiecrats of the South. You see, Donald Trump is one person, but there's a big block of white supremacists that supports him. Many of them from the South, but all over the country, who are the descendants of those Dixiecrats. And that's who many of our men linked arms with against us. Fortunately, most blacks, including black men, did not fall for the okie doke. But enough did to where Kamala lost and Trump win. And let me say this in closing. I said many times leading up to the election that we needed to support Kamala just to keep Trump out of office. Whatever issue you have with her, let's get her elected and take up those issues then. Because we didn't want this. We didn't want this. I pray we get out of it. I pray we come through it. The country. I pray the country comes through it. All right? I am Reverend and Civil Rights Attorney Augustus Corbett. Thank you for watching this video. And remember, stay woke.